Welcome to Don't Ask That Question. I'm Kelly O'Mara, and today I am going to have a conversation with Dr. Peter Breggin about a recently published review that shows that the chemical imbalance causing depression is not supported by this new research. A review of several randomized controlled trials, which was published in the Journal of Molecular Psychology last week. Dr. Breggin is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. He's a prolific writer and author of dozens of books, including the now famous Talking Back to Prozac. He has more than 70 peer-reviewed scientific reports and articles published in numerous medical journals. Dr. Breggin has testified before Congress, has been a psychiatric expert in more than 100 trials on behalf of patients who have been injured by psychiatric drugs, electroshock, lobotomy. Dr. Breggin's accomplishments are extreme. And I'm happy to say that Dr. Breggin was one of the first to call out the alleged chemical imbalance for what it was, a fraud. Now, decades later, he is vilified, and I couldn't be more happy to have him on the show to discuss the history of this fraud with him. So welcome, Dr. Breggin.
Hi. Well, throughout history, medicine has always wanted to make believe that psychological, spiritual, psychiatric problems were all one and the same and under their control and medical in origin. And that goes back to Hippocrates. There's actually the earliest known play discovered from the ancient Greeks was about a physician who thought he knew his patient was crazy and was going to lock him up, and it turned out he was crazy. And so thoughtful people like playwrights have been aware of this since several hundred years before the birth of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But it's continued throughout history that doctors have made this claim. However, drug companies really got into this, probably the real beginning of it, about 1954, when they found that they had neurotoxic agents called antipsychotic drugs now. They called them at the time neuroleptics, attaching to the neuron.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that these drugs, Thorazine, Haldol, still used, one of the very early ones. Now we have Abilify and Seroquel and Risperdal and Navain and on, often masquerading as antidepressants. And it was discovered that these drugs blocked dopamine, which is actually the main nerve trunk to the frontal lobes. In other words, is blocking all the higher human processes, and it was just making these people zombies. But out of that came the first fraudulent claim that this drug was correcting a biochemical imbalance in the frontal lobes because it worked giving it to antipsychotic patients, so it must be to psychotic patients, so it must be correcting a biochemical imbalance, which was utter nonsense because anybody could see that the patients were just zonked out. They became mute, very quiet, catatonic. They didn't talk much. They didn't resist. They were docile. They would line up peacefully in the line at the cafeteria. You could march them around the hospital to take them somewhere else. And it all happened in the first day. The nurses told the doctors in the first day they had a wonderful drug. It was so much quieter on the ward, so much easier to handle the patients. They were half dead. Mm-hmm. Their brains were just shot by the blocking of the dopamine. And to one degree or another, this is happening with a lot of people who just think they're taking antidepressants now. Mm-hmm. Or sleeping pills, Seroquel for sleep. They're actually getting their whole frontal lobe system suppressed, and it depends on the dose and them as to how flattened they get. Mm-hmm. Eventually, I got into this arena, and when I saw the first pictures in a medical book I was going back now because I hadn't had a textbook probably since medical school. And I'm looking at their early 70s. I'm looking at a textbook, and it shows a picture of the effects of dopamine, and the picture shows the brain, and it shows the big nerve trunk going up to the front of the brain, shows it being blocked. And I thought it was going to say, and therefore the drugs, in the caption, therefore the drugs cause a frontal lobotomy. Instead, it said, no, therefore dopamine excess is the cause of schizophrenia.
Oh,
But of course, it was silly. It was actually silly because they used it in veterinary medicine. And I wrote all about this in 1983 in regard to these drugs that we used them in veterinary medicine. They were used to suppress dissidents in Soviet Union, including Haldol, which was a main human drug. And they didn't use Haldol so much in veterinary medicine because it caused too many problems for the poor dogs.
So let me ask you, so was it the theory, the chemical imbalance theory, right? That, oh, your serotonin or your dopamine or your norepinephrine, they were out of whack. They weren't, there wasn't a right level.
Yeah.
Was that, the pharmaceuticals, or was it medicine that
I think it's mainly the pharmaceutical companies that finally get onto this because it's a marketing tool, very definitely a marketing tool. And I think the doctors wouldn't necessarily have pushed it as hard as the pharmacy people, but the docs have always been looking for something to tell them they were real doctors. Even electroshock now, they claim, corrects biochemical imbalance is when it's a repeated severe traumatic head injury caused by electrical overwhelm of the brain, leading to coma and convulsions. So they've always been looking for that. But Eli Lilly did something new. They only had something like $1 billion worth of business. And they started to anticipate they had a blockbuster. And they actually based everything they did on the realization that since 1 or 2 studies were showing they thought some relationship between depression in animals and low sluggish serotonin, although some studies seem to show it was too much serotonin, it was not very good. And the studies were very sketchy. They were using spinal fluid. I mean, what does spinal fluid serotonin got to do with the overall functioning of something as subtle as whether you're depressed or anxious or angry or loving or happy or sad? I mean, that is ridiculous. Because serotonin nerves go throughout the entire brain, the most widespread system in the brain. The largest is probably dopamine, but it's concentrated in certain areas, whereas you got serotonin of biochemistry going on in the gut. You have it in the bloodstream and throughout the whole brain. So it didn't make sense to single it out as the cause of a discrete human experience. It didn't make any sense, but they don't care. It sounded great. So even before they got the drug approved, they were buying doctors to have them give speeches on serotonin and depression. They made a really big deal about it. And they then went through these studies. I think they began maybe in the mid-1980s, and they got the drug approved in late 88. And I think it came out in 1989, as I recall. I could be off a little bit. And leading up to it, all they talked about was the biochemical imbalance. And it just got everybody all excited. It was going to be the first drug specific for a disorder. They forgot that claim had been made earlier around the antipsychotics, but also earlier around the earliest antidepressants, which were inhibitors of a whole series of biochemical reactions, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They were making the claim vaguely, but Eli Lilly made it a huge campaign. But they ran into a serious problem. Didn't work. Patients were not getting better, and they were dropping out of the studies because of overstimulation. And later on in 1993-4, I would become the medical expert for all the combined suits against Eli Lilly concerning Prozac. And part of my job as the scientist was not just to review all the internal documents, but I interviewed in person or by phone anybody who would talk to me at the FDA. And it so turned out that the chief psychiatrist in charge of adverse effects was happy to talk to me privately, providing I never disclosed who he was. And eventually I ended up disclosing it. I can't even remember whether you agreed or not, but I thought there was such a public health issue there that my life wasn't being a journalist. My life was being a person who was a doctor and had to let people know what was going on. And this fellow told me he realized that because of the cocaine overstimulation, amphetamine-like effects, that people who were depressed could be stimulated into suicide, and that he was seeing suicidal ideation increased in the reports. He was seeing increased depression in the reports. I don't think he was seeing violence, which we saw later. And that he proposed doing a stimulant profile in the official description of the drug, what's officially called the label. People know it as the package insert. It's this thing you see as summarized as a full page in magazines on the backs of the ads for drugs. And the FDA refused to do it. They were deeply under the influence of political figures at that time. Dan Quayle was doing a reworking of some of the functioning of the FDA as vice president. Dan Quayle.
Didn't Bush, wasn't he on the board of Eli
Yep,
Lilly?
I was going to get to that next. That's right.
Oh.
You're really on top of this stuff. So Dan Quayle was from Indiana,
right,
and had deep ties to the Lilly Company, which was one of the major companies in Indiana.
Sure.
And Bush had been on their board of directors, even though he wasn't from Indiana, and he had resigned from the board. I think when he became president, yes, when he became president, but there was a tremendous political support for this. So what they did, they didn't put any of it in the label. Later, I would get a lot of it in the label with through my own work, but they had to give patients sedative drugs like the tranquilizers, like Valium, that kind of drug, Xanax, or sleeping medications to calm them down, so enough of them would even stay in the trials. They were so overstimulated.
Oh, interesting.
So when it came, and I cover this in Talking Back to Prozac in detail with dates and times and everything, very detailed book. Available as a cheap paperback now, still in print.
Oh, it's a wonderful book. Really, it is. It's just so informative.
Well, thank you. And the FDA discovered that the regular trials did not show it was effective, but 2 trials gave it enough borderline statistical, maybe doing a little better. So they approved it, even though it was the 2 trials which they now knew included addictive sedatives. So basically, Prozac got approved in combination with addictive sedatives, but nobody was ever told. Now, over the years, very quickly, doctors could see how some of their patients were getting crazy, overstimulated, irritable, angry, hostile. So they began to give Prozac the first dose, along with something like alprazolam, Xanax, to calm them down, which then meant they were getting a sedative drug and an addictive drug, highly addictive in the case of Xanax, very addictive. So I was realizing they didn't have any scruples at all, none at all. They were just going to do whatever they could, and the FDA was going to cooperate with them, which really prepared me later on to do the deep dive, deeper than anyone else had done, into the background of COVID-19, because I didn't get all the way into the global predators at that point in time. They were really developing themselves even back then.
Right.
but I have no awareness of thing. I was just stunned by how predatory the drug companies were and how much they controlled the media an awful lot back then.
Mhm.
But I did get a lot of big media. I shouldn't complain too much in those early days. And that was just before the drug companies got the right and began to heavily advertise direct to consumer on
Mhm.
television in particular. And after that, I was no longer invited. I was 6 times
Right.
on Oprah and 7 times maybe on Larry King Live. I was on CNN. I was on the business channels. On one of the business channels, they actually had me critique the president of Eli Lilly getting an award for Prozac. I mean, can you imagine that happening now? And I said, well, actually, Prozac's a fraud on CNN. And it wasn't, what's the CNN business channel?
Um,
That's what it was on. It was on, I'm forgetting what it's called.
yeah, I'm forgetting what it is too. Well,
But
let me interrupt you there because now that we're getting into the marketing of these antidepressants, I want to read something from my book, Psyched Out. I want to read a couple things. So I find it interesting that Pfizer, of all the of all the pharmaceutical companies who sell antidepressants, when I was writing the book, I'd go to their website and read what they said about the drug. Surprisingly, Pfizer was the only one that actually kind of said it exists, that the chemical balance exists. Okay, all the rest of them use, very lawyer words. May, we
yeah, right.
believe,
Yeah,
we
they were not
suppose.
supposed to. They're really not allowed to say it exists by the FDA. They got
Right.
away with
So,
it.
so I'm gonna read this because I think it's really interesting. I say, for example, Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company that manufactures Zoloft, one of the SSRI antidepressants listed by the FDA for black box warning, until July of 2005, reported on the company's Zoloft website. And this is a quote. Although the way Zoloft works for depression, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder is not completely understood. So they're saying, we're not sure what all that is. We don't understand all those things. What is understood, and this is still a quote, what is understood is that Zoloft is a medicine that helps correct the chemical imbalance of serotonin in the brain. It doesn't say we believe it does, it says it does. I
I've
thought,
never seen that. I should have read it in your book. That's amazing.
I mean,
It's a good book, folks. Buy the book.
so anyway, so I just thought that was sort of interesting now that it's come out 17 years later after, my book, that they're saying, yeah, no, there's no data that supports this. Let's just put a nail in this coffin. In fact, the authors of the recent report that's gotten so much attention in the news. I mean, Tucker Carlson, he nailed it. He just nailed it the other night about this report. I don't know if you saw it, but if you haven't, go to YouTube and watch Tucker Carlson talk about this report because he had a lot of fun with it. So it says their conclusion is, quote, we support it is time to acknowledge that the serotonin theory of depression is not empirically substantiated. Like, okay, there's nothing here, right? So I'm going to go to you in my book because I quote you, and this is from your book, Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry. Okay, and so you say, despite more than 200 years of intensive research, no commonly diagnosed psychiatric disorders have been proven to be either genetic or biological in origin, including schizophrenia, major depression, manic depressive disorder, and various anxiety disorders, the childhood disorders such as attention deficit hyperactivity. At present, there are no known biochemical imbalances in the brain of typical psychiatric patients until they are given psychiatric drugs. It's great. That was just, it's wonderful. So anyway, I go on to quote 6 or 7 other doctors and neurologists
Mhm.
who say the same thing. The people, Glenn Mullen, Fred Bauman, they all say the same thing. And this is back in 2005, I wrote the books. That's 17 years ago, right? So we were all talking about the bull that is the chemical imbalance. But you remember, Peter, you could go up to somebody and you go, hey, do you think that, a chemical imbalance really exists? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. My doctor,
Yeah, it's the greatest, I call it the greatest advertising marketing campaign in the history of the world. Convinced all the intellectuals, everybody.
Yeah. I mean, it was amazing. Anybody, even to this day, you could probably walk, because most people aren't aware of this new study. But they'd probably still say, oh no, my doctor said that, I'm probably, I've got a chemical imbalance and that's why, and I'm like, okay, whatever, I just let them go, but so when you started writing about it, were you ever attacked for, coming out and saying the truth?
Imagine every attack you can.
Yeah,
Every attack you can.
right. And it was lengthy and it was long term. It wasn't just, every time you stood up to tell them the truth, you were attacked.
Yes, until in the early 1990s, they decided that they had to absolutely 100% act like I didn't exist. And I don't know how they managed it, but it happened and was everywhere. And so after that, my books didn't get reviewed. It was very hard to get published, although I kept managing somehow to get published. It was a terrible struggle.
Right.
In fact, I had $100,000 contract back in 2005 for a book on psych drugs. And the day after my editor left, with a very major publisher, my editor left, the editor-in-chief called me and said, we're canceling that contract. And that was kind of the end of where I could just get a big advance.
Huh.
And even my books were bestsellers. Talking back to Prozac was like 800,000 copies,
Right.
and also Toxic Psychiatry, which is a much better written and user-friendly book. I took years to write it. It wasn't pushed. There's my first big popular book. I'd already written medical books, and that's when I became, what do they call it now? Not just censored, but when they exclude you from the world. Not zeroed. What is that word? It's hard. It's a hard word to come out with, but it's a very common word. Oh gosh. Canceled. So
Oh,
they
you got
managed.
canceled. Sure.
I was completely canceled and no longer on all the big TV shows and stuff. We continue with our work. And I don't get bitter. I know what the world's like. And I know, God, I mean, that was a big accomplishments I had. And we did, by the way, my campaign led the FDA to two big things that did happen in regard to both of these drug issues, the antipsychotics and the antidepressants. In 1973, I wrote a book, a medical book called Psychiatric Drugs, Hazards to the Brain. And the producer for one of the top TV shows called me and said, we're interested in doing a show maybe on psychosurgery. And I said, do it on tardive dyskinesia. He said, what is that? I told him that it's this terrible disease that commonly afflicts anybody taking the antipsychotic drugs. All the drugs are doing is blunting the patients in the state mental hospitals. See, the public wasn't taking them then. Now the public is taking them.
Mm-hmm.
So we have many more cases of TD and this terrible blunting that occurs, but people don't know it. And
Right.
Families think it's the mental illness because doctors don't tell them that if you're twitching and grimacing and your neck is twisting, it's actually a neurological disease. They think that, poor Jane's really
That was
lost
caused
it.
By those drugs. That was caused by the drugs.
It was definitely caused by the drugs. And oh my gosh. The show was huge, and it had several different docs on it, including me. And it caused the FDA to get a lot of flack. So they called a hearing to reevaluate, entirely because of the turmoil that caused around them, to evaluate the label, the information that would go into all the antipsychotic drugs, maybe 10 of them at a time. And they held hearings, and the outcry was sufficient to really distress everybody. At the time, the head of the FDA, in the first preliminary hearing, without any people testifying, just him, I got just the one with him and the drug companies, he said something so interesting. First, he said, well, he thought doctors knew about tardive dyskinesia and all this fuss was unnecessary. But then he started asking doctors, and they really didn't know much about it because drug companies been hiding it. Medical schools hid it. And then he said, but listen, we won't do anything that hurts your sales. Now, how can you promise the drug companies you won't do anything to hurt their sales if you're going to increase the warnings about their drugs?
Right.
It was so weird.
Very surreal.
But it was very surreal. Part of my early education on just how unethical these people are, that was Paul Lieber, who, when he quit the FDA in later years, went to work as a consultant to drug companies. I met Lieber at one of the hearings. I was testifying out, went up to him in a group, struck out my hand. I said, I'm Peter Breggin. He said, I know who you are, and turned his back on me.
Yeah, well.
So I was having an effect. But then we did the same thing, but this time with a lot more people joining in. I was the first one to blow the whistle on the violence and suicide and all those other things with the antidepressants. But then other people joined in. We had hearings. And there's one of these little miracles that takes place. The executive director of the committee, of the FDA's committee, called me. These are days before cell phones and stuff and emails, and said, you've got this new paper out outlining all these adverse effects from Prozac. I want to distribute it to every committee member. I was blown away. I mean, they're going to get it in their little pre-pack, And it was a good article. It was published in the International Journal of Risk and Safety in Medicine. And in the article, I said, well, violence and suicide are a big issue, but it's not the biggest. The biggest issue is the underlying problem, which is that these drugs are amphetamine-like and cocaine-like, and they produce insomnia, agitation, anxiety, psychosis, and crashing into depression and violence associated with the amphetamine-like overstimulation effects. And to my amazement, the committee, and this would never happen now, this FDA is so corrupt since COVID. Oh my God, it would never happen. They put in a sentence which looks like it reads out of my article. They don't call it a stimulant profile. They just say this is a series of events that's associated with all the SSRIs. And it went under the warnings. And technically, under the law, the warnings have to have a reasonable amount of causation to them before they're put in. So this was very significant, and was very, very important in all the lawsuits I was involved in, because first of all, I could show my article, show the sentences I'd written, show what's in the label and say it's true. And Joe Jones, indeed, there's evidence scientifically that he could have gotten psychotic and manic and violent like he did from Zoloft or Paxil or whatever.
Right. Well, that's one of the things. It's like, look, I look at the FDA and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that the approval process, let's say Eli Lilly did, 25 studies, okay? When they were doing their clinical trials, they had, 25 different ones involving thousands of patients, right? And so 23 of those all came up with, not statistically significant percentage of people were helped by it.
That's right.
But 2 did. So 23 just showed this doesn't work, period.
That's right. This happens all the time.
But two clinical trials happened to work. they approve it because you need 2,
Right.
even though you have 23 that didn't.
And
Right?
consider the fact that the people who run the trials are bought and paid for by the drug company.
Right.
They don't even get to evaluate the study. They send the data back to the drug company who evaluates the study. And then the drug company writes a paper for them that they publish, that the whole thing is rigged. It's amazing they can't more often make these drugs look good, but they have a terrible time doing it. They have to fudge the stats. They have to do all kinds of imaginative, theoretical things to even make them look like they're going to work, because they're neurotoxins. They're not good for the brain. They make people sick.
Right. Right.
And the only way they make people better in the long run is by blunting their sexuality, their passion, their feelings. Sure, the may blunt more often blunts their anger than exaggerating it with time. Over time, the general effect of whatever you're doing to your brain, whether you're smoking, whether you're drinking, whether you're doing marijuana or taking psych drugs or getting concussions to your head, in the long run, you lose your engagement with life. You lose your connectedness. You lose your depth of feeling. And maybe you'll get more irritable and a little persnickety and angry. But over time, you don't even have the capacity to get violent. You've been ruined. Now, the violence occurs often with the young people, and often when they've been on the drug for usually just a few months, and it hasn't worn them out yet, which takes years.
Right. Right.
By
So,
the way, folks, let me give a caveat here. You listening to me, you may be tempted to stop your antidepressant or whatever drug you're taking. We got to do a caveat.
Yes.
It's as dangerous to stop the drugs as it is to start them, because what happens with any drug that affects your brain is despite what your other doctors are telling you, it can cause withdrawal, because the brain hates the intervention of the drug. It doesn't want its normal serotonin or its normal dopamine disrupted, which is what the drugs are doing. They're not fixing imbalances. They're causing imbalances in whatever place they intervene with. And that's proven because they give them to animals who don't have emotional problems. And that's how they find out that the drug is causing biochemical imbalances in the brain. And if they can't show that, the FDA probably isn't going to accept the drug. They have to show the mechanism of action. And the mechanism of action is disrupting, not improving. It's disrupting normal balances.
Right.
So you're depressed not because you have a biochemical imbalance, but because somebody's died, or you have a terrible marriage, or you're not living life well, or you're intruded upon by abuse from childhood. I mean, there's so many things. Or you're living under COVID-19, or your country's a totalitarian state. I went behind the Iron Curtain before it came down in Berlin, East Berlin. Everybody looked depressed. In fact, they looked like they were in a state mental hospital. They all looked grim and downtrodden. So
anyway, don't stop taking your meds.
Don't stop taking
without
them. No,
talking
you
to
do it.
your
Thank you
physician.
for helping me get off that little riff.
Yeah.
So I have 2 books that you can get information on, and a book that's very accessible to the public and not very expensive. Medication Madness talks about the harms of drugs and has a chapter on withdrawal. Now, in addition to that, I've written the only medical book on psychiatric drug withdrawal, certainly the only book by a psychiatrist, and the only one that came out in English originally. I think one of my friends may have published a book. He's not a psychiatrist, but a physician overseas. But that tells you about how psychiatrists don't know anything. They don't even try to write a book or articles about withdrawal. I've been doing it. And they just want to keep people on. That's how they make their living now. So don't hurry and come off your drugs. Read about it. Try to find a therapist. Be patient about withdrawal. Learn how to do it. That can be very, very serious. People have committed terrible crimes coming off the drugs because their brain's out of whack from the drugs.
Right. So I want to expand a little bit here on the whole chemical imbalance theory. And I wrote about it in my book, and you've written about it in several books. So one of the things that I always thought was kind of amusing when people say, oh yeah, my doctor said, I may have a chemical imbalance. My first thought is, well, what test did he give you?
Yes, that's right.
What did he give you a test to show you which chemicals
Yeah,
or,
did he do a
or
spinal tap? Did he send your
what?
blood off?
Yeah, what is the test? Oh no, he just said it. I said, okay. And then it makes you wonder, you go, okay, well, we know there is no test to measure the chemicals in your brain until autopsy. Um,
Well, live, you could go in live. It's not a good thing. We're getting more and more tests, and those are the things that we're with tracers in the brain and so on. And Joanna Moncrief's article that you've been talking about, that there were tracer studies that could not find any abnormalities in the brains of people in regard to the serotonin. So metabolism. So we are now getting looks in the brain. They didn't have them then, and the looks in the brain have confirmed there is nothing wrong.
right. So, but beyond that, the question is, how do they know what level is right? Who's the right brain level person that they're judging everybody else taking Prozac or Zoloft or
Well,
whatever?
they didn't even have levels then. They were making it all up.
Well, of course. Okay. And I don't think they're able to measure it today to the point where they can go, yeah, we're going to give you, this many milligrams.
Well, they can't measure, they still can't measure it in individual people with any accuracy. They're
Right.
getting averages.
Okay. But whose is the right level?
But there is none. There is none. But what you can do is you look and you I put a little different emphasis on it than you are. There's been enough work done now to show that there aren't abnormalities. So I mean, they're able now to do enough with these tracers to say they all fall within the same average range. Period.
Okay. I mean, I'm actually kind of being sarcastic about it because
I know you are.
17 years ago there was nothing.
There was nothing. It was
And
BS, and it's BS now.
yeah,
But it's constantly repeated. It is such a selling point for the drugs that doctors will keep repeating it. Doctors,
billions
don't know.
and billions of dollars.
Oh my God, yeah.
I mean, unbelievable amount of money spent on antidepressants based on a fraud.
Exactly.
The chemical imbalance. So it's and the sadness really is, there's been a lot of harm done to people.
Still is, yes.
And still is. People, I wonder, will people start to rethink, continuing on the drugs, knowing that, what they've been told isn't true? One of the things, there's been a lot of books, and one of them that I read that I thought was pretty impressive was from Dr. Irving Kirsch, The Emperor's New Drugs, when he did that study. And that was quite a while ago, I'd say 15 years ago that it came out. And basically, what he did is he looked at all the antidepressants and basically, found that they were no more effective than a placebo. Right?
Well, that's actually true. And especially if you, instead of giving, see, one of the problems is what they do is they give a sugar pill as their placebo that has nothing in it, basically, or an inert powder in it that's harmless. So if you're on the antidepressants, the doctor hears you're having insomnia and he knows you're on the antidepressant. So he knows which drug you're taking. So the double blind doesn't really exist, or he sees your hands shaking and he knows it's not the placebo, or you're complaining of dry mouth and blurry vision or other abnormalities of your general functioning that happen with these drugs. And I had an internist who said he could always tell when his patient came in and had been put on SSRI since he saw him last, because they were always just a little tenser and just not quite there. This is a great internist I had back in Bethesda, Maryland years ago. And now doctors don't pay attention to any of this stuff, and they make believe it doesn't exist. Or if it was dopamine and you're comparing, well, that's another story. The way they test for the antipsychotic drugs is a complete fraud. They test them against patients in withdrawal from antipsychotics.
What? Say that again?
All right. What they do is they take a whole group of patients off their antipsychotics in a state hospital usually. All of them go into withdrawal. They all get worse. They then give half of them or whatever the new drug, and they all feel better because they're being removed from withdrawal.
Oh,
It's that evil. This is evil.
wow.
I was the
Wow.
first person to ever see that and report on it. And nobody cared. It's like, oh, they don't want to face how evil it is. First of all, they're torturing patients, taking very disturbed patients off their drugs. And probably these are patients that have been used again and again for different drugs. So God knows how much they've been torturing them. And then they leave some of them off the drug for such a long period of time, they're getting worse and worse, while the patients they put back on a new antipsychotic drug are being relieved of withdrawal symptoms. It's as if you took a bunch of acute alcoholics into a hospital. They've just been drinking that day. They're acute alcoholics. And you take away everybody's alcohol, but they've all been drinking gin. And then you take half of them and you put them back on bourbon, and they come out of the DTs and they come out of all of these things that come from withdrawal. And you say bourbon's a cure for alcoholism or
Right, right.
with whatever. It doesn't make any sense. It's hard to even
No.
explain. It makes so little sense.
I want to get a little bit into the the abnormality. Okay. Is there an abnormality that can be detected through, medical tests? That is depression, that is ADHD, that is, these psychiatric diagnoses.
None. They would get excited. Oh God, there were years of excitement surrounding that the stress hormones went up. And then after a while, the body became less sensitive to the stress hormones, which is just a normal feedback. You're getting too much thyroid, you're getting too much of cortisol, which is the cortisone-like response to stress. But of course, it turned out that, of course, people with severe, upsets would, of course, be more stressed, but it was not specific for them or anybody else who was stressed. Anybody stressed had these changes in their bodies. So that just fell through. And it was for a time, they were selling these tests, to show that your reactions were up in your these hormones and hormone agents. So they've tried things since the beginning of time. The father of American psychiatry, Benjamin Rush, who actually did good things during the American Revolution. He was a freedom fighter, God bless him.
Yes.
But such a jerk as a psychiatrist and a physician that even his colleagues would say, "Oh, good old, good old Ben Rush, look out for him," because he looked quirky to sane people. Well, Rush said that on all his autopsies of mental patients, they had inflammation of the brain. That was his impression. He didn't have controls. It was all BS. It goes back to then.
Right.
And he was doing, and this is what psychiatrists are like. This is a characteristic of the profession. Now, he was also dealing with cholera and very bravely going and treating people, but he was bleeding patients way beyond anybody believed in it. And one of his students actually bled George Washington to death. And,
Yeah. It's interesting. I did a piece when I was with the Washington Times. I think it was called The Forgotten Dead at St. Elizabeth's. And, St. Elizabeth's was the first national, psychiatric facility that they built for Civil War guys. Anyway, so what was interesting,
I didn't know that. That's interesting. I knew it was a very old institution, but I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I had heard that there were a lot of bodies out there, right? Buried like in football fields with no headstones. And so I went out and I investigated when I was at the Times, and I wrote this article. There are hundreds and hundreds of bodies that are unmarked in graves out there throughout the facility, the grounds. So anyway, when I was there, I was talking to the priest on the property, and he goes, "Oh, you need to go to the government warehouse over in Gaithersburg because they have all the brains." It was amazing. So I got permission to get into this warehouse, and it was kind of like this huge, huge warehouse, just rows and rows and rows of, crates and boxes. And the guy is taking me through all the aisles, and we get to this room that's all glass, and just shelf after shelf after shelf of these big glass jars full of brains.
One brain per jar, I'm sure.
Yeah, pardon me?
Just to get one brain per jar.
Yes,
I want to
one
get the
brain per
people's
jar.
picture of this.
Yeah.
One brain per jar.
And there were, literally hundreds, if not thousands of brains in this room. And I thought, well, that's interesting because at the time, if you look, I also got a copy of their entrance books when you sign in to St. Elizabeth's. I was able to take pictures, photographs, and it said they were being admitted for intemperance, right? Which is, they drink, excessive masturbation. These were the reasons that were given for their entry into St. Elizabeth's, these veterans. So as you walk down the main hallway in the main building of St. Elizabeth's, they have brain slices of people's brains that are framed on the wall. And if you read the things underneath it, there's like an explanation of what it is. All of these guys had syphilis. They all had syphilis. And when you get syphilis and it's not treated, you get a little nutty, right? So I thought, well, how interesting. They weren't putting it together at that point. It seems like, you know what I mean? They're taking all these brains, and we have all these
so interesting. I've never heard this before. This is really, well, now penicillin cures syphilis. So
right. When did penicillin
comes
come out?
During World War II, toward the end.
Oh, okay. So this was the Civil War. St. Elizabeth's was built right after the Civil War. So anyway, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that at that time they're saying, oh, he has syphilis, that's what these brains are. But they're not putting it together that their behavior may be representative of that actual disease rather than, excessive masturbation, intemperance, whatever, these very weird entries into this book.
That is so interesting. It's as if, psychiatry makes believe that everything is physical, but when the patient has something physical, they don't recognize it. It's weird. And I've seen that in my practice. If you're considered a mental patient, that's all you are. I have referred years ago a patient who, right at the age that women get MS, clearly to me had multiple sclerosis, and sent it to a neurologist who sent her back saying there was a mental disturbance. Well, one eye was drooping, she was losing. It was bizarre. So, I sent her to another neurologist, and unfortunately, it showed up on CAT scan. The doctor, as I did, made the diagnosis from her symptoms. And that's not the only time that happened to me. It happened to me a few times when I was a resident in psychiatry and an intern. I also did some psychiatry in my internship. And I would find the patients sent in once who had a brain tumor, but it was so disturbing to the patient, you couldn't look at their, get a good pupillary thing and see that the back of the eye was swelling out, which you get with big brain tumors. And I suspected brain tumor and just sent them out to the ophthalmologist and said, look in her eyes. And the brain tumor. Another patient was sent in, she had septicemia. And she was psychotic, and she had a mental history, and she didn't want me to examine her. And I finally managed to talk her. I used to spend time with my admitting patients, and I finally got a stethoscope on her back, and it's going, just inside is really, really sick. And I said, you're really sick. You got to let me help you. She said, okay. And immediately transformed from psychotic to cooperative.
Right.
And we transferred her over and she had septicemia. So there's something about my colleagues that they're so obsessed with now with biochemical imbalances, they won't see a case of diabetes if the person comes in and says, I'm dying of thirst and peeing all the time. I
Right.
mean, it's just really quite terrible. This
Where do you think this is all starting? Is it starting in medical school? Is it the pharmaceuticals have, too much control over what's being taught in medical schools? I mean, is it all drugs?
Well, now it is, yes, but this goes back a long way to doctors just wanting so badly to believe their patients were, in fact, having physical diseases
Mhm,
and then making them up when they don't find any.
mhm, mhm.
And I don't know how that led to their ignoring them when they did have them.
Right.
Well, but that happened a lot when we got all the people with their abnormal movements. They said that they had they didn't have a neurologic disease. They said that these state mental hospital patients, they just all had this copycat freaky abnormal movements. I mean, they get very confused, my colleagues, because the whole thing is a lie. Psychiatry has no basis, so it's a lie. There is no medical specialty that deals with the brain that tells you anything about routine mental disturbances. Now,
Mhm.
it's true, if you have MS, you can get depressed and anxious. You have heart disease, the first thing they may notice is anxiety. There are connections between the real illnesses, and then they affect us emotionally. That's a given. But when a person is not being afflicted with a physical illness that you can identify, the odds are overwhelming. They don't have a biochemical imbalance. It's their lives that have made them miserable.
Mhm.
Um,
It's interesting because I went a long time ago, years and years ago, when I got divorced. I was very depressed, right? Naturally. And so I went to a therapist, psychologist, and I would talk to her once a week, right? And she didn't believe in drugs, didn't believe
Good.
in them. Okay. And she said something to me that I'll never forget. She goes, your brain is so strong, it can make you well and it can make you sick.
Oh, definitely.
And I thought, when she was saying that to me, it just kind of clicked and it made sense. Yeah, I'm upset. I got divorced and, I was having palpitations, like anxiety attacks, right? And after talking
Who
to her,
doesn't during a divorce?
well, right. And after talking to her for, I guess I went, saw her once a week for 6 months. I've never had an anxiety attack ever. And that was 30, 40, 40 years
That's
ago.
wonderful.
And she didn't believe in drugs, and I never got put on drugs. And I mean, it just it made sense to me. Our brains are very, very strong, and they can do both things. They can make you sick and they can make you well, you know?
That's right. And they can help you recover from so-called schizophrenia or deep depression. I've never started a patient on a drug since I finished my training. You had to during the training, or I would never become a psychiatrist.
Mm,
But once I was done with my training, I already knew that the drugs were doing more harm than good. So I would see somebody come out of a mental hospital, and I would sometimes families have brought people out of the mental hospitals to see me because they read about my work and they saw what was happening to family members. And I never increased medications, and I never started people on meds. I would, if I could, withdraw them.
mhm.
And in most cases, if that's a pretty strong person, no, fairly reasonably normal person with a support system, they come off of drugs. But if they're multiple drugs and they're still living at home at age 25 or 30, and they're still in the situations they were since childhood, become much, much harder because they can't stand the withdrawal symptoms. And
Mhm.
it's not that they need the drugs, it's that you literally can't stand the withdrawal symptoms. They'll go smoke marijuana or something and just disrupt the process. But most people can come off the drugs. And I've treated every kind of thing, even mania, which supposedly you can't talk down. Well, you can't talk it down once it's out of control, or if the person's on drugs, it's very hard. But when somebody starts to get manic, you can address the mania and tell them get a grip, show them new thoughts, new activities they can do, not let themselves get
Mhm.
overcome by it, help them understand that they were starting to get depressed, and they took flight into mania. It's not complicated. Mania is like a huge escape relief from depression, and people get to understand it. And it's something that's dealable. Human suffering is dealable in psychotherapy, or especially family therapy. The person needs support. So I always prefer family therapy,
Mhm.
because then two people are learning to help each other and understand each other. And it actually tends to be shorter than individual therapy, because they, within months, they're just feeling great in their marriage, and they know about love and communicating, and they're finished,
Right.
because they're
What would you
supporting
tell,
each other.
what would you tell people? I'm going to wrap this up. I'm up to my time, but now
Let's,
that this
before you
very,
wrap it up, let's mention my new book. I really
oh
want
yeah,
people, my
please
new
do.
work.
Please do.
Oh, right
Let's,
now? Okay.
yeah,
Well,
sure.
Ginger and I have a new book out, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey. It is the book about COVID-19 and the criminal conspiracies and activities behind it. One of my proudest endorsements is from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK, because when he was coming out a little after me with his amazing book, focused totally on Fauci, the real Anthony Fauci, he actually gave our book an endorsement as the book for understanding the deep background for all of what's going on.
Wow, great.
And we also have a lot on Fauci, and it's interesting to see two different minds, the lawyer and the psychiatrist. And I'm also like more historian. And he was looking as the lawyer at all these interconnections of corruption with the research he was giving out, and who he would give and wouldn't give research to, and what he did to people who didn't agree with him about HIV or about anything, and how he built a domain of controlled researchers. And so his book was amazing. And I've got a whole bill of accusations for a whole chapter against Fauci, and lots of materials. But the two different men, we came with different descriptions of this evil guy. It's really interesting. So they're both worthwhile books. But that
What's the name of your
endorsement
book
touched
again? Say it again.
COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey. You can
Good.
get it from us at a discount by going to wearetheprey.com. That's a website just for the book, wearetheprey.com. Or you can go online and get the book from Amazon and other bookstores. And from Amazon, you can also get the audio book, and you can also get the ebook. The
Oh, okay,
audio book has
wonderful.
just come out. People are really buying the audio book. A lot of people bought the ebook because we made it really inexpensive. I didn't want anybody to say they couldn't afford the book. So I think it's $2.99 for the ebook.
Great, great. I
So,
recommend it. I've read it, and I recommend it to everybody. Truly, it was
and our
very good.
website's breggin.com. And the best way to follow my work, our work, me and Ginger's work, she's doing more and more with me. It's amazing how she's doing more and more with me now on the radio show and my TV shows. We
Oh,
now have
good.
like a radio show we do together.
Oh, wonderful.
And you can follow all that by going onto Breggin.com and getting our free Breggin alerts, the free Breggin alerts.
Okay.
But
All right.
we have a TV show, we have that goes out as radio as well. Then we have my radio show with Ginger, and we both write columns, and you can follow them from our frequent alerts. That's the best way.
Good. Thank you for telling my audience that. Look, Dr. Breggin, I have always been a huge fan of yours
Yeah, I know it. And I've been a
for
huge
so
fan of
long.
yours. You're amazing. You're just amazing. You're an actual reporter, a real investigative reporter. Oh my God, you're going the way of what? We're all getting antiquated.
Yeah, but I wanted to say thank you, number one, for being on my show today to kind of walk through this fraud of chemical imbalance. But more so, I want to thank you for everything that you've done over the last, 40 years, 50 years that you've written and papers and books. And I think we're all a little better because you have. So thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you
Thank you.
so much.
All right. So
And you
that's
too.
it.
It's all back to you because you've been doing stuff that's amazing.
Well, we're all trying. Anyway, thank you for watching. Don't Ask That Question. We'll see you next Wednesday, and we hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much.